At the end of the Napoleonic War, Rothschild had one of his couriers come back and declare that France had won the war. Meanwhile, he had his little agents selling off shares as they watched Rothschild constantly. So they panicked and started selling off their shares. Meanwhile, he has other agents going back and buying everything up penny on the dollar. And the next day seized control of the Bank of England. Now, looking at the founding of our country back in its infancy, we had 13 colonies bustling. Trade was going great. Commerce was good. We had shipping going back and forth between Europe. We had our own monies at the time. It was called colonial script. Everything was going good except for one thing. It was cutting into the profits or the monies of King George III. So he put a ban on the use of colonial script. If that wasn't enough, they also added in this tea tax and stamp act to further oppress the colonies. After a bit, the colonies got sick of it and they actually said, no, this is not good, so they started their revolution. Just prior to the Revolutionary War, though, in 1791, there was a bank set up here in North America modeled after the Bank of England. It was allowed to practice fractional reserve banking. This means it could loan money at interest on money they didn't even have. In 1787, the colonial leaders assembled to replace the Articles of Confederation. Both Thomas Jefferson and James Madison remained steadfast, unmoved, and towards a privately owned bank. They had seen the problems caused by the Bank of England. Thomas Jefferson quoted, "If the American people ever allowed private banks to control and issue their currency, first by inflation, then by deflation, the banks and the corporations would grow up around them, will deprive the people of their property until their children wake up homeless on the continent that their fathers conquered." Only 3 years after signing of the new Constitution, the newly appointed Secretary of Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, proposed a bill calling for a new privately owned central bank. This bill was brought to Congress in the same year that Amschel Rothschild made his pronouncement from his flagship bank in Frankfurt, "Let me issue and control the nation's money, and I care not who writes its laws." Alexander Hamilton was a tool of the international banker. One of his first jobs after graduating from law school in 1782 was as an aide to Robert Morris, the head of the Bank of North America. A year before, Hamilton had written a letter to Morris saying, "A national debt, if it is not too excessive, will be to us a national blessing." In 1811, the bill was given to Congress to renew the Bank of the U.S. The debate was heated, and representatives of Pennsylvania and Virginia passed a resolution asking Congress to kill the bank. The press of the day openly called the bank a swindle, a vulture, a viper, and a cobra. Oh, wouldn't it be nice if the actual press did their job for once? A congressman named P.B. Porter attacked the bank from the floor, saying, if the bank's charter was renewed, Congress would have planted in the bosom of the Constitution a viper, which one day or another would sting the liberty of the country at its heart. Nathan Rothschild warned that the U.S. would find itself involved in the most disastrous war if the bank's charter were not renewed. The renewal of the bill was defeated by a single vote in the House and was deadlocked in the Senate. At this time, America's fourth president in the White House, James Madison, like Jefferson, was a staunch opponent of the bank. His vice president, George Clinton, broke the tie in the Senate and sent the bank into oblivion. Within 5 months, England attacked the U.S., and the War of 1812 was on. But the British were fighting Napoleon, so the war ended on a draw. 1814, the money changers were down, but they were far from out. Why this guy's face is on any money here in the United States sure beats the hell out of me. Nobody back then evidently liked him. They wanted to kill him. They knew he was a Rothschild stooge. The only reason I can think he's even on a bill is because the bankers liked him. 1 year after Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo and the Rothschilds' takeover of the Bank of England, the American Congress passed another bill allowing the formation of another privately owned central bank. The new bank's charter was a copy of the previous bank's, with the United States government owning 20% of the shares of the bank. The shares were paid by Treasury, taxpayer money, up front. Then, through fraudulent practice of fractional reserve banking, the money was formed into loans with the loan money being used by private bankers to purchase the remaining 80% of the bank's shares. Just as before, the primary shareholders remained a secret. However, the largest blocks, about one-third of the shares, were sold to foreigners. The Second Bank of the United States was deeply rooted in Britain. By 1816, the Rothschilds had taken control of the Bank of England and new privately held Second Bank of the U.S. 12 years after the Second Bank of the U.S. manipulating the American economy, the American people had had enough. Opponents of the bank nominated a senator from Tennessee, Andrew Jackson, the hero of the Battle of New Orleans, to run for president. Initially, no one gave Jackson a chance to win this presidency. The banks had long been able to control the policies with the money. To the surprise and dismay of the money changers, Jackson was swept into office in 1828. Jackson was determined to kill the bank at the first opportunity and wasted no time trying. However, the bank's 20-year charter didn't come up for renewal until 1836, the last year of his second term. If he could survive that long, during his first term, Jackson rooted out the bank's minions from the government service. He fired 2,000 of 11,000 employees of the federal government. In 1832, his re-election approaching, the bank struck an early blow. Hoping Jackson would not want to stir up the controversy, the banks asked Congress to sign a new renewal bill 4 years early. Congress complied and then sent it to the president for signing. Jackson vetoed the bill. This veto bill is one of America's greatest documents, clearly laying out the responsibility of the American government towards its citizens, rich and poor. You know, it's the same old stuff, constantly manipulating, bribing, paying off, swindling, coercing. This is how these people work, and throughout this video, I've laid it concrete that this is their modus of operation. Although Jackson killed the central bank, unfortunately, fractional reserve banking remained in use in the number of state-chartered banks. This fueled economic instability in the years before the Civil War. Still, the central banks were out, and as a result, America thrived as it expanded westward. The central bankers struggled to regain power of the bank, but to no avail. And then finally they reverted to the old central banking formula of war to create debt and dependency. If they couldn't get their bank any other way, America could be brought to its knees by plunging it into a civil war, just as they had done in 1812 after the first Bank of the United States was not rechartered. All right, now we're going to take a look at the Rothschilds and the Civil War. At this point, I want to slip in an excerpt from my documentary film, American Civil War 2.0, where I go actually into quite depth of the Civil War. That includes the slave trade as well. So you guys bear with this one. I think you'll find it quite interesting. History books, the media, school systems, etc., abound in falsehoods and inaccuracies of the Confederate and Southern history. We're going to work off this fact sheet and help clarify and dispel these rampant inaccuracies. We'll start off with the first one, myth. The War of 1861 through 1865, the American Civil War, was fought over slavery. Fact, terribly untrue. The North fought the war over money, plain and simple. When the South started secession, Lincoln was asked, "Why not let the South go in peace?" To which he replied, "I cannot let them go. Who would pay for the government?" Sensing total financial ruin for the North, Lincoln waged a war on the South. The South fought the war to repel Northern aggression. There's more to it, and we're going to get into it right now. General William Tecumseh Sherman, a general in the Northern Army during the Civil War, made a rather cryptic comment in his book, Memoirs. I, General Sherman, the truth is not always palatable, should not always be told. The Hidden Face of the Civil War by Otto Eisenhelm.
A similar comment made by author and biographer for Senator Zachariah Chandler of Michigan, a senator during the Civil War, the secret history of the days, concealing many startling revelations, has yet been sprangily written. It is doubtful that the veil will ever be more than slightly lifted, the hidden face of the Civil War, page 5. Those who have attempted to lift the veil have discovered that there is indeed many hidden truths about the fateful period of U.S. history. One who only hinted at the truth about the real causes of the Civil War was Colonel Edward Mandell House, a Jew, who wrote in his book entitled Philip Drew, Administrator, in 1912. In it, he has one of his characters make the following statement. Cynical Europe said that the North would have to appear that a war had been fought for human freedom, whereas it was fought for money. That's Philip Drew, Administrator for Colonel Edward Mandell House, page 119. After the demise of the Second Bank of the United States, the state banks, those chartered by various states in the Union, operated the banking system of the United States and issued all of the monies. Almost exclusively, this money had been backed by gold, not by debt and paper money. However, the financial position of the federal government had been slowly deteriorating. At the outbreak of the war, the United States Treasury was in greater shambles than Fort Sumter. Southern banks had been quietly withdrawing large amounts of funds on deposit in the North. When Lincoln took office, he found the Treasury was empty. The Civil War actually started in 1837, the year after the charter for the Second Bank had expired, when the Rothschild family sent one of their representatives to the United States. His name was August Belmont, and he arrived during the Panic of 1837. He quickly made his presence felt by buying government bonds. His success and prosperity soon led him to the White House, where he became the financial advisor to the President of the United States. Another of the pieces of this enormous puzzle fell into place in 1854 when a secret organization known as the Knights of the Golden Circle was formed by George W. L. Bickley, Confederate agent, a discovery in history by James D. Horan, who declared that he had created a fateful war in 1861 with an organization that had engineered and spread secession. Another leading character in this story of the Civil War was J.P. Morgan, later to become one of the world's most wealthy and influential industrialists and bankers. Mr. Morgan went to Europe in 1856 to study at the University of Göttingen in Germany. It is not inconceivable that one of the people he met while in college was Karl Marx, who was active during this time writing and publicizing his ideas about communism. Since Marx was in and out of Germany on a regular basis, and because Morgan later became an agent for the Rothschild family. At any rate, it was during this time that the European bankers began plotting the Civil War. According to John Reeves, in an authorized biography entitled The Rothschilds, the Financial Rulers of Nations, a pivotal meeting took place in London in 1857. It was at this meeting that the International Banking Syndicate decided that America, the North, was to be plotted against the South under the old principle of divide and conquer. This amazing agreement was collaborated by Mackenzie in his historical research entitled The 19th Century Committee to Restore the Constitution, Fort Collins, Colorado, January 1976 Bulletin. The plotters realized that once again the American people would not accept a national bank without a reason for having one, and once again the plotters decided upon war. Wars are costly, and they force governments into a position where they must borrow money to pay for them. And this decision was made once again to force the United States into a war so that it would have to deal with the issue of how to pay for its costs. But the plotters had a difficult problem. What nation could they induce to fight against the United States government? The United States was too powerful, and no country, or in combinations of countries, could match them in a balance of power showdown. Canada to the north and Mexico to the south were not strong enough and couldn't raise an army adequate for the anticipated conflict, so they were discounted. England and France were 3,000 miles away and across a huge ocean that made supplying of an invading army nearly impossible. And Russia had no central bank, so the bankers had no control over that nation. So the bankers made the decision to divide the United States into two parts, thereby creating an enemy for the government of the United States to do war against. But the bankers had to locate an issue to use in causing the southern states to secede from the Union. The issue of slavery was ideal for that purpose. Next, the bankers had to create an organization that could promote secession amongst the southern states so they would divide themselves away from the federal government. So the Knights of the Golden Circle were created for that purpose. Abraham Lincoln began to see drama unfold as he was campaigning for presidency in 1860. He saw the war as an attempt to split the Union, not over the issue of slavery, just for the sake of splitting the Union. He wrote, "I have never had a feeling politically that did not spring from a sentiment embodied in the Declaration of Independence. If it, the Union, cannot be saved without giving up the principle, I was about to say I would rather be assassinated on the spot than surrender it." That's Abraham Lincoln, The Boy and the Man by James P. Morgan, page 174 and 175. So many of his fellow Americans also saw the war as an attempt to split the Union. It was not uncommon for men to declare that they would resign their officer's commission if the war was perverted into an attack on slavery. The impeachment and trial of Andrew Jackson by Gene Smith on page 98. The Knights of the Golden Circle were successful in spreading the message of secession amongst various southern states. As each state withdrew from the Union, it left independently of others. The withdrawing states then formed a confederation of states as separate and independent entities. The independence of each state was written into the Southern Constitution. We, the people of the Confederate States, each state acting for itself and in its sovereign and independent character. That's from A Quest from a Hemisphere by Donzella Cross Boyle, page 293. This action was significant because should the South win the war, each state could withdraw from the Confederation, reestablish its own sovereign nature, and set up its own central bank. The Southern states could then have a series of European-controlled banks, Rothschild, of course, a Bank of Georgia, a Bank of South Carolina, etc. And then any two could have a series of wars, such as in Europe, for centuries, in a perpetual game of balance of powers and politics. It would be a successful method of ensuring large profits could be made on the loaning of monies to the states involved. The War of 1812 was instigated by Rothschilds to force a renewal of their charter for the Bank of the United States. When this charter was vetoed by President Andrew Jackson in 1836, the Jews participated in a financial panic and set up their plan to bring about the Civil War, which would simultaneously destroy American Republic and despoil the wealthy Christian families of the South. As we had the Jewish subverters in the North in August Belmont, also the South had their own version. Both Rothschilds' stooges, Judah P. Benjamin, was known as the brains of the Confederacy. Its court Jew, the statesman of the Lost Cause, and even the Confederate Kissinger as successively Attorney General, Secretary of War, and Secretary of State in the Confederate Cabinet. He was President Jefferson Davis's closest and most trusted advisor. When we think of the Confederacy, big names that automatically come to mind are the three legends carved into the side of Georgia's Stone Mountain: President Jefferson Davis, General Robert E. Lee, and General Stonewall Jackson. Significant figures for sure, but in the grander power scheme of things, including President Davis himself, were outranked by the Jew, Judah P. Benjamin. The fact that Benjamin's name is so relatively unknown, ironically, a testament to the awesome behind-the-scenes power that he wielded. Unfortunately for the South and the North, Benjamin's influence served neither of the Americas. His loyalties lie elsewhere, like in Rothschild's London. Before and during the war between the states, where there is a Jewish influence supporting both the cause of the North, Unionism, and the South, secession, Louisiana Senator John Slidell, not a Jew, well, at least not outwardly, but his family ties to the elite of European Jewry runs deep. Slidell's daughter is engaged to Baron Frederick Erlanger, a French Jewish financier based in Paris. Erlanger helps to fund the Confederacy, gouging the South with usurious interest rates, similar to what the British were doing to the North, interest rates and fees. Erlanger's financing the South was confirmed even by today's New York Times, is directly linked to the House of Rothschild. Papa-in-law Slidell would later serve the Confederate States government as foreign diplomat to Great Britain and the French Emperor Napoleon III. Now, the niece of the influential senator is married to Northern financier August Belmont, Rothschild's Jewish boy, Democrat and Democratic boss supporting the Northern cause. At least at first, after the war, Confederate Slidell will make his Unionist nephew-in-law, Belmont, his political protege. Also hooked up with Senator Slidell in this tangled North-South Rothschild's knot of financial political intrigue is fellow Louisiana Senator Judah P. Benjamin, the Jewish big shot who goes on to become the Confederacy Attorney General, then Secretary of War, and then Secretary of State. Through a shadowy fog of 150 years of elapsed history, we can now discern a pattern of divide and conquer, balance of power, conspiratorial actions being played upon both sides and with tragic consequences. Early on in the war, in the Battle of Bull Run, the South had the opportunity to take D.C., but it was Judah P. Benjamin, the man so admired by Solomon de Rothschild, who have whispered the poisons in Davis's ear, telling him not to take D.C., and thus blowing the chance to win the game early on in the South. And after Walker had been made the scapegoat and fired, who replaces him as War Secretary? None other than Judah P. Benjamin. As the War of 1812 was a continuation brought on by the Rothschilds directly to bankrupt the United States and force upon them their second usury bank. It was the same story with the Civil War with one difference. This time it was to divide the country and split it in two. So for Judah P. Benjamin to not want the war to end early really fits into line. So could the new Secretary Benjamin's subsequent 1861 interference with the generals act so controversial that they would force a congressional investigation? And his bizarre refusal to supply them as requested have been a ploy designed to prolong the war until Rothschild could bury both sides in debt before sending the family's British and French hitmen to divvy up America into two spheres. Establishment historians will later claim that Benjamin's stubborn defiance of the generals was due to lack of supplies in the South, but given how early it was in the war, the claim that supplies were low seems to be like a cover story, kind of like they play it today. If lack of supplies had been the cause of Benjamin's decision, Generals Stonewall Jackson and P.G.T. Beauregard would not have had a reason to dislike Benjamin as they did, but they hated his ass. That in mind, let's take a closer look at the shady Mr. Benjamin. Outwardly, the esteemed Jefferson Davis is the top dog of the South, the president of the Confederate States of America, but behind the scenes, Judah P. Benjamin, with his European connections, gift of gab, and impressive intellect, is, in the grand scheme of things, more powerful than Davis. What the banking agent Alexander Hamilton, traitor, had been to George Washington, the trusted Benjamin P. Davis, and then some. Like Hamilton, Benjamin was also born a British subject, West Indies. There's simply no exaggeration of the influence of Judah P. Benjamin. In the fall of 1859, de Rothschild, son of Baron James de Rothschild of Paris, had come to the United States as a tourist. His travels in the North and South are recorded in a series of letters to his cousin Nathaniel in London. Rothschild met with prominent politicians, surely with Benjamin, and commented on the issues of the day. His views were pro-Confederate, of course, break the country in two, and his letters urged his cousin Nathan to use the family's influence to gain the recognition of the Confederacy by the European powers.
All right, now we're going to take a look at the Rothschilds in the Civil War. I'm going to read a couple excerpts from a guy by the name of Des Griffin. Pretty interesting couple things in here I want to utilize. It would be extraordinarily naive to even consider the possibility that a family as ambitious and cunning and as monopolistic minded as the Rothschild could resist the temptation of becoming heavily involved on the American front. It was only the second nation in history that had ever been formed with the Bible as its law book. Its uniquely magnificent constitution was specifically designed to limit the power of the government and to keep its citizens free and prosperous. Its citizens were basically industrious immigrants who yearned to breathe free and who asked nothing more than to be given the opportunity to live and work in such a wonderfully stimulating environment. In this particular portion of this video, we're going to look at the Civil War and what was the agenda behind the war. Was Lincoln part of that agenda? Was he working for the Rothschilds? We're going to look and see where Rothschild money came to play. And we're also going to look at the outside influences in this particular campaign. And that would be in opposition and who came to our aid as a country. Wars are always fought for many reasons, always by lies, fraud, and deception. This particular war, one of the misconceptions was it was about slavery. We're going to find that this particular story has a completely different twist to it. Since World War II, over 50 times the U.S., through its little tools, CIA mainly, have balkanized, which means broke apart many states and overthrown many ruling parties. So happened to be the case in the Civil War. It appears that the actual intention was to split the country in two, aided by England and France, to weaken the country. Well, as it turns out, Abraham Lincoln, actually, like many other people in power, actually their family's history has been shrouded in secrecy. That would be the case with Abraham Lincoln. He was actually born from A.A. Springs, which his original name was Springsteen. So Abraham Lincoln's actual birth name would be Abraham Spring. They changed their name from Springsteen to Spring. Without getting all deep and crazy with the bloodlines of the Illuminati, it appears that Lincoln was related to the Rothschilds. Quoting out of the Establishment Times of London states, if that mischievous financial policy which has its origins in North American Republic, constitutionally debt-free money, should become indurated down to a fixture, then that government will furnish its own money without cost. It will pay off its debts and be without a debt to the international bankers. It will become prosperous beyond precedent in history of civilized governments of the world. The brains and wealth of all countries will go to North America. That government must be destroyed, or it will destroy everything on the globe. In simple terms, I think it would be safe to say that, as in the War of 1812, the goal was to drive America into bankruptcy or into debt slavery further, so that they could have their way and get their central bank going again. I would say it's safe to say that that was the same case with the Civil War, with the exception of one thing. They were this time actually aiming to divide the country in two. The results, the fruit of this unique experiment, were so indescribably brilliant that America became legend around the globe. Many millions across the far-flung continents of the world view America as the beautiful and the promised land. The big bankers in Europe, the Rothschilds and their cohorts, viewed the wonderful results born by this unique experiment from an entirely different perspective. They looked upon it as a major threat to their future plans. It's clear that the Rothschild money came in through France and England. The one little shocker for him was that Russia had actually came to the aid. Evidently, he was buddies with Lincoln, and so he sent ships to the East Coast, and actually they sat off the coast of San Francisco. Abraham Lincoln worked valiantly to prevent the Rothschilds' attempts to involve themselves in the financing of the Civil War. Interestingly, it was the Tsar of Russia who provided the needed assistance against the British and French, who were among the driving forces behind the secession of the South and her subsequent financing. Russia intervened by providing a naval forces for the Union blockade from the south in European waters, and by letting both countries know that if they attempted to join the Confederacy with military forces, they would also have to go to war with Russia. The Rothschild interests did succeed through their agent, Treasury Secretary Solomon P. Chase, to force a bill, the National Banking Act, through Congress creating a federally chartered central bank that had the power to issue U.S. banknotes. Afterward, Lincoln warned the American people, quote, "The money powers prey upon the nation in a time of peace and conspires against it in a time of adversity. It is more despotic than monarchy, more insolent than autocracy, more selfish than bureaucracy. I see in the near future a crisis approaching that unnerves me and causes me to tremble for the safety of our country. Corporations have been enthroned, an era of corruption will follow. The money power of the country will endeavor to prolong its reign by forcing upon the prejudice of the people until the wealth is aggregated into a few hands and the republic is destroyed." Lincoln continued to fight against the central bank, and some believe that it was his anticipated success in influencing Congress to limit the life of the Bank of the United States just to the war years that was the motivating factor behind his assassination.